So we're going to start in next 2 minutes. Till then, let me quickly introduce Hyde Park 4 session at Hall Brill. And let me introduce Chairman Dr. Anita Sethi. She has just joined. Then we have Co-Chairman Dr. Vidya N. Then we have Convener Dr. Shalu Bageja, Co-Convener Dr. Raka Chatterjee, and Moderator Dr. Nilut Parna Deroy. So we are just waiting for a moderator and we'll start in next 1 minute. Till then, I request the first speaker, Dr. Shweta. Can you please share your PPT? Be ready. Let me check if Dr. Shweta we have. I guess we don't have first speaker. We have to start with next speaker, Dr. Sonali V. Kumar. Please be ready. We will start in next 2 minutes.
Should I share my screen?
Let's wait for 1 minute and then we can share. So, Dr. Anita, do you want to moderate this session? You're the chairperson for this session.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, you want to say something in the beginning?
Yeah, welcome everyone to this Hyde Park session, and we're looking forward to hearing a lot of interesting subjects and studies that all our ophthalmologists have been up to. And I would request everyone to stick to the time because there is a paucity of time, so everyone must stick to the time. And I'm sure we'll have a very interesting session. So I think we can start with Dr. Sonali.
Before we start, let me quickly tell you that we are very tight on timelines. So 4 minutes for speaking and 1 minute for discussion. So I request all speakers, please stick to the timeline. This session will go till 2:55 p.m. So we are good to go with start with Dr. Sonali. Please share your screen.
Okay. Is my slide visible?
Yes, visible. You can go ahead, doctor. Thank you.
Okay. Very good afternoon to all of you. And I would like to thank AIS for giving me this opportunity. So the title of the paper which I'm going to present is Surgical Outcomes of Levator Resection versus Frontally Sling Surgery in Unilateral Congenital Ptosis. Treatment of congenital ptosis is challenging as results are unpredictable. The ideal surgical technique, which gives optimal cosmetic outcome without complication, is still evolving. Tarsofrontally sling is the standard of care when the levator is poor, but it has a high rate of complications. Supramaximal levator resection has been advocated over the past 2 decades as an alternative treatment modality. However, there are very few studies which have actually compared the outcomes between these two procedures in congenital ptosis. Hence, this study was conducted at our center in patients with unilateral congenital ptosis having poor levator action. It was done at Army Hospital Research and Referral, and it was a prospective interventional comparative randomized study. It was done for 6 months, and patients having congenital ptosis with poor levator action were included in the study group. Our acquired ptosis and ptosis as a part of the syndrome like Marcus jaw winking phenomenon and blepharophimosis were excluded from the study group. Patients were enrolled into 2 groups. In group A, the sling surgery was performed, and in group B, the levator resection was done. And each group, 22 patients were enrolled. Detailed history was taken, and comprehensive eye evaluation was done. And maximum patients underwent surgery under general anesthesia. All patients were evaluated on day 1, 1 week, 1, 3, and 6 months after surgery. Surgical outcome parameters were changes in marginal reflex distance 1, vertical fissure height, and inter-eyelid difference of MRD1. Descriptive statistics like mean standard deviation and percentages were calculated, and paired t-test was done to find out any statistical difference between pre and post-operative finding. And good surgical outcomes were MRD between 3 to 4 mm, inter-eyelid difference MRD between 0.5 to 1 mm, and vertical fissure height between 7 to 9 mm. In group A, the mean age was 7 years. There were more male patients and left eye was involved more. In group B, the mean age was 5 years and there were more female patients and right eye was involved more. We could achieve good outcome in 73% of cases in group A. And under correction, sling exposure and suture oblique knot abscess were noted in 2 patients each. In group B, we could achieve good outcome in 77% of cases. Under correction was noted in 4 patients and lid swelling was found in 1 patient. We compared the pre and post operative MRD1, vertical palpebral fissure height, and inter-eyelid MRD1 difference, and we found the results were comparable between the two groups. These are some photographs of patients who have undergone sling surgery. These are the photographs of patients who have undergone levator resection at our center with good surgical outcomes. So levator resection preserves the dynamic wing, and it provides a better cosmosis by giving a natural eyelid counter. So the current study demonstrated that supramaximum levator resection is an effective alternative to sling surgery in congenital ptosis patients with poor levator action. Both the procedures are equally effective, but risk of infection is high with sling surgeries. However, levator resection resulted in undercorrection and in some cases significant lag ophthalmos, which become less visible after 3 months. We compared the outcome in group B with other studies, and they also reported a success rate between 70 to 80%. Then we compared the outcome with Young et al. And Dave et al. Between the two groups, and they also found the similar comparable results between the two groups. So the strength of the study, like it was the first study which had exclusively compared the outcomes between the two procedures. It was a prospective randomized clinical study. Equal number of patients were distributed in each group, and all surgeries were performed by a single surgeon. The limitation of the study is small group size and short follow-up. So to conclude, levator resection is an alternative for sling operation that leads to good surgical outcome by avoiding all the complications which are associated with sling surgeries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sonali. Would any of the other members of the chair like to ask her any questions?
Dr. Sonali, you can stop sharing the screen, please. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Shalu?
Yeah, Dr. Sonali, this is a good study. And yeah, supramaximal levator resection is a good alternative for severe ptosis patient. And but we need to explain to the patient that they may require the second surgery. So did any of the patient had undercorrection or any other complication like fornix prolapse in your study?
No, we found like in group A, in which the sling surgery was found, we found undercorrection in 2 patients and suture abscess and that knot abscess in 2 patients and exposure in 2 patients. So that in which in patients where undercorrection was noted, they were advised a repeat surgery and they underwent second surgery at our center.
No, in the other group, the supramaximal levator resection.
Yeah, in group B, like in 4 patients, we noted undercorrection. However, the visual axis was clear. So we didn't advise the second surgery for these patients.
And none of the patient had fornix prolapse?
No, in group B, we didn't face this problem.
No, I'm talking about supramaximal levator resection.
Yeah, in group B, we did levator resection. So we didn't face this problem. Actually, we found the undercorrection in 4 patients and lid swelling was noted in 1 patient.
Thank you, Dr. Sonali. Gentle reminder for time up. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Sonali. We'll go to the next speaker. This is Dr. Ruby Moharana.
Dr. Anita, I want to take this opportunity to announce that whenever the question answer session is going on, we have 1 minute, right? So till then, I request like what Dr. Ruby did. Till then, 1 minute, you can share the screen so that we can award time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Ruby, please go ahead. Dr. Ruby, you need to unmute yourself. Just accept the message.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead. Now we can hear
Good
you.
afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Ruby Moharana, and the topic of my discussion today is neck operation in a case of ocular torticollis, misdiagnosis or lack of appropriate referral. So torticollis or wry neck is an abnormality where the neck position is twisted or turned to one side. And the commonest cause is muscular, that is congenital due to a short sternocleidomastoid muscle. Ocular torticollis, however, is an abnormal head posture which is adopted in order to maintain binocularity or dampen nystagmus. And the management of these conditions is completely different. So this is a single case report where the case presented to Apex Eye Care, Cuttack, Odisha for treatment of left face turn. Complete ophthalmic evaluation and surgical management was done and written consent was taken from the patient for participation in the study. So this is a case of a 13-year-old female patient who came to us with chief complaints of neck pain and left face turn since childhood. She had undergone multiple eye consultations since childhood, but no treatment had been advised. Finally, she had visited a neck surgeon who had operated on the neck 3 months back, and her discharge reports just mentioned left side neck surgery with her medications. However, she had no improvement in the neck position, but she had increased neck pain during studies, so she had to ultimately drop out of school. When we saw the patient, her systemic examination was sternocleidomastoid muscle insertion. There was no facial asymmetry. The MRI brain and spine had already been done and it was normal. So on ocular examination, the best corrected visual acuity was 20/60 in both eyes. There wasn't any significant refractive error, but binocularly with the left face turn, the patient had a vision of 20/20. The anterior and posterior segment evaluation was normal. So coming to the external examination, patient was ortho for distance and near and had full and free movements. However, she had a horizontal jerk nystagmus, which was right beating with moderate intensity and amplitude, and the null was in dextroversion. So that is why she was adopting a 25 degrees left face turn, which we measured with the help of a goniometer. So with this, the diagnosis was modified to nystagmus with 25 degrees left face turn, and the patient underwent Parkes 5678 procedure, where 5 millimeters of MR resection with 8 millimeters of LR resection was done in the left eye, and 6 millimeters of MR resection with 7 millimeters of LR resection was done in the right eye. Post-op day 1, she had less than 5 degrees of left face turn, and she was ortho in the primary gaze. As we can see, she is ortho in the primary gaze, and she has no nystagmus in the primary gaze. Post-op 3 months also, she had the same status quo and significant reduction in her neck pain, and she was able to join back school. So this is the pre and post pictures of the patient, and we can also see over here that she had a scar mark, which is more evident over here where she had undergone surgery in the neck. So coming to discussion, very few cases have been reported in literature where ocular torticollis was missed and the patients were operated to release the sternocleidomastoid muscle, suspecting that to be a stiff muscle. Hence, it is very important to diagnose cases of ocular torticollis because it might be secondary to nystagmus or squint. And the treatment of these two conditions is completely different, and the patient doesn't have to go through the harrowing multiple surgeries and multiple consultations if it is diagnosed in time. A simple test of just covering one eye can help in diagnosis, as ocular torticollis is mainly adopted to maintain binocularity and optimize vision. So in primary position, we should always look for any squint or nystagmus, and we can check the restriction to active and passive movements of the neck. Coming to the conclusion, ocular torticollis is a treatable condition but can be missed. Adequate counseling and proper referral for specialist treatment is required, and treatment can significantly improve the quality of life of these patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruby. That was really a very interesting case and very well highlighted. Dr. Deori, are you here? Would you like to ask any questions?
Yes, that was thank you, Dr. Anita ma'am. So that was a very nice presentation. Congratulations, Dr. Ruby, for picking up the patient after although she had undergone sternocleidomastoid. Did the patient have any superior oblique or inferior oblique problem with this child?
No, this child was completely ortho in the primary gaze. There was no oblique overactions or any squint in the primary gaze.
Okay,
So
usually they, sometimes if it is a congenital one, they usually present with the oblique problem also. So that is what I just wanted to know. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So we'll now go on to the next speaker, Dr. Shweta. Dr. Shweta will present her paper.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we are presenting a case of chalcosis bulbi where we did the histochemical analysis in the anterior lens capsule. So it's a case of 27-year-old female who presented with gradual painless decreased vision in the left eye since 4 months. There was history of minor trauma to the left eye with some unknown speeding object 8 months back while working on the swing machine. There was no history of acute inflammation in the affected eye then and thereafter. No medical opinion was taken, and there was no significant systemic history. On examination, the vision in the right eye was 6/6. In left eye, it was perception of light with inaccurate PR and RAPD. Ocular adnexa and periorbital area did not show any sign of injury or entry wound. On slit lamp examination in the left eye, there was early case of placial ring along with the sunflower cataract. There were no anterior chamber cells or flare. The eye was white overall. On posterior segment evaluation of the left eye, diffuse vitreous strands were seen with vitreous haze. Gonioscopy was normal. The right eye evaluation was within normal limits. Intraocular pressures were 12 and 14 millimeters of mercury. The ultrasound of the left eye was suspicious of intraocular foreign body. CT orbit further confirmed the retained IOFB in the vitreous cavity of the left eye. ERG of the left eye showed grossly extinguished response. So with the diagnosis of presumed Charcot-Marie bulbi, we took the vitreoretinal consultation where IOFB removal was not advised in view of poor visual prognosis. However, the patient had cosmetic concerns. With proper counseling and under guarded visual prognosis, she underwent left eye cataract surgery with IOL implantation. Intraoperatively, the capsular excess tissue was obtained, which was sent for histopathological analysis in 10% buffered formalin. The postoperative period was uneventful and the visual acuity remained same. This is the histopathology slide. Image A is hematoxylin and eosin staining showing golden brown granule deposits in the posterior layer of the anterior capsule. Image B is the Orson staining, which is showing the positive copper reaction in the deposited granules. So IOFB represent 18 to 41% of all the open globe injuries. Pure copper causes acute Charcot-Marie simulating endophthalmitis. Usually two types of pattern are seen. Localized pattern, the metallosis changes, they are limited to the nearby area where the IOFB is being retained. And in generalized pattern, more diffuse ocular changes are seen. The copper content, the size, the location of the foreign body determines the ocular response. In our case, the trauma happened 8 months before the onset of the symptoms. The decrease in vision was insidious and mainly posterior segment signs were seen. There was negative history of the redness and overall the eye was white on presentation. So all these factors point towards the localized pattern in our case, which is usually seen when the copper content of the IOFB is less than 85%. Copper deposition can lead to KF ring, Sun-Clarke cataract. It tends to get deposited in the ILM also. The other reported changes seen are fibrillary degeneration of the vitreous, non-granulomatous inflammatory reaction, RP clumping, RD, and phthisis bulbi. In early stages of metallosis, removal of IOFB may reverse the ERG changes, but in our case, the ERG response was extinguished, which occurs in the end stage of metallosis and is suggestive of poor visual prognosis. PR was also inaccurate, and vitreoretinal surgeries in such eyes may increase the risk of phthisis bulbi. The Orson stain stains the elastic fibers, copper-associated protein, and hepatitis B surface antigen. Lens capsule is a type of basement membrane, and copper has a special affinity for the basement membrane. Orson stains react with the deposited copper granules and gives a positive reaction. The histochemical detection of the copper through Orson has been classically described for the chronic liver diseases. The copper deposition in the anterior lens capsule has also been described in systemic diseases like monoclonal gammopathy, multiple myeloma, Wilson's disease, and in local causes, persistent Charcot-Marie bulbi. But in all these case reports, the anterior lens capsule analysis was done with the help of X-ray spectroscopy, which is a quantification method. In our case, we did the Orson staining, which is though not a quantification method, but a confirmatory method for a condition which tends to get clinically diagnosed. So to conclude, the Orson staining of the anterior lens capsule as a marker for the presence of copper content of retained IOFB, it's a cheaper and a much more widely accessible alternative to the electron microscopy and spectroscopy, especially in the developing countries. However, its sensitivity and specificity for detection of copper in anterior lens capsule is yet to be established and need more number of cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. That is an interesting case. So we can't see you, Dr. Shweta. Would be nice if we can see you. Yes, that's very nice. So how do we pick up these cases early? You're saying that because it was so late in onset, we lost the vision, and your staining is basically only after we have done a surgery. Is there any way of picking it up early? Does your spectroscopy, does it pick it up early?
Ma'am, copper has got the affinity.
Sorry, yes.
Copper has got the affinity to deposit in the basement membrane. So in any case of Charcot-Marie bulbi, I think if there is an early presentation and the cataract has not yet developed, it would be difficult to analyze the anterior lens capsule for copper deposition through spectroscopy also. And I think for copper content to be detected, some element of cataractous changes should be there in the eye. So early detection, I don't think it's really possible until and unless the patient has the array of symptoms in the eye.
Okay, so I mean, any foreign body that goes in, there isn't anything that we can do to sort of detect. What about
detect per se for the content, ma'am? It would be difficult.
What about early EOG, ERG changes? Is there any chance of that?
Ma'am, when we are clinically suspecting and the patient is giving a positive history, the EOG, ERG early may detect the changes have started in the eye or not. But per se, what kind of eye it is there, we cannot for ERG and EOG for that. For that, we need to have the analysis through spectroscopy or with the Orson staining.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shweta. We'll go on to the next case now.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Daniel Varte.
Yes, ma'am. Shall I present?
Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Daniel.
Okay. I'm Dr. Daniel Varte. I'll be presenting a case of a dermoid cyst simulating mucosal of a lacrimal sac. As we all know, dermoid cyst is a choristoma that results from the sequestration of skin during embryonic development. Continuous secretion by sebaceous gland and sweat glands contained within the lesion causes a gradual increase in size of the cyst. A superficial orbital dermoid cyst, usually present with a painless nodule, most commonly located in the superior temporal and occasionally superior nasal part of the orbit. But the dermoid cysts that are situated close to the lacrimal passage are extremely uncommon. Here we present a case of a 31-year-old Indian female presenting with a painless swelling medial to the medial canthal area of the right eye, which was gradually increasing in size for the past 2 years. It was associated with watering of the right eye. The mass was firm in consistency, measuring about 10 into 5 millimeter, but not adherent to skin, and no tenderness was observed. Roplus was negative. Suspecting it to be a mucosal of a lacrimal sac, syringing was performed and NLD was patent. On CT scan, a mass was observed in the lacrimal sac area with no intraorbital or intracranial extension. The mass of 5 into 8 millimeter size was excised through an incision of DCR approach under local anesthesia and sent for histopathological examination. Intraoperatively, syringing was done, which was found to be patent, confirming it to be confirming no injury to the lacrimal passage. On histopathological examination, we found that there was a stratified squamous epithelium and sebaceous glands were seen in the pathology department. They confirmed it to be a dermoid cyst. On immediate post-op follow-up and up to 2 months post-op follow-up, there was good cosmesis with no recurrence, and NLD was patent. This is the picture of the 14-day post-op. A superficial orbital dermoid cyst is most commonly located in the superior temporal and occasionally superior nasal part of the orbit, and that which are situated close to the lacrimal passage are extremely uncommon. Here we present one such case of a superficial orbital dermoid cyst present close to the lacrimal sac. Watering which was associated in this case is thought to be because of the compression of the lacrimal drainage system by the dermoid. There are few published literature which with dermoid cysts involving the lacrimal drainage system. Dermoid cysts, for conclusion, we can say that dermoid cysts should be kept as one of the differential diagnoses in cases presenting with swelling in the inferior nasal part of the orbit or in the lower eyelid. Presenting symptom may mimic a case of a mucosal of lacrimal sac in cases presenting with swelling in medial canthal area with watering, as it was seen in this case. Dermoid cysts have a good prognosis if we excise it completely. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. So what was the reason for the watering that you felt in this case?
Ma'am, we felt that since there was a dermoid cyst at the lacrimal fossa area, so there might be a compression or there might be a disturbance in the lacrimal pump mechanism. Okay. So which causes, since after post-op, up to 2 months, there was no complaint of watering of the eye.
Okay. Is Dr. Vidya here? Would you like to ask any questions, Dr. Vidya? Okay, maybe she's not here.
Dr. Anita, I just got an update, just a quick update that once we are having the discussion, 1 minute discussion, let's avoid sharing the screen because there is some issue in the recording. So let's finish this 1 minute discussion, then the next speaker will share the screen.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So anybody would like to ask Dr. Daniel any questions? It's an interesting case, not so unusual, but an interesting presentation. Okay, so we'll move on to the next speaker then.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Sure, you can announce the next speaker.
I'm afraid I don't have the list.
Dr. Khushbu Chauhan. I'll send you a list, ma'am, in personal chat.
The list, yes.
Do we have Dr. Khushbu?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Please go ahead. Dr. Anita, I'm sharing a screen. I'm sharing a link with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm presenting the case of acute proptosis with orbital compartment syndrome due to bilateral pansinus mucophyocele, which is an unusual occurrence, management, and its result. I have no financial disclosures for this presentation. Introduction. First, let me give a brief introduction regarding the mucocele. Mucocele is an epithelium-lined mucus-containing cystic lesion, which has the potential to gradually expand and fill the sinus completely. Incidence of mucocele is generally normally 0.4 to 0.8% in general population. It may occur in paranasal sinuses, oral cavity, appendix, gallbladder, or lacrimal sac. When the contents of the mucocele become infected, it is termed as mucopyocele. It may involve frontal ethmoidal sinus, which is being the most prevalent one, then the sphenoidal, and then the maxillary one. Patient may present with the complaints of the displacement of the globe, diplopia, ocular pain, headache, Horner syndrome, or panhypopituitarism. A 37-year-old Indian female came with the chief complaint of forward protrusion of left eye for 1 week and also with the diminution of the vision. There was a forward protrusion of left eye for 1 week, which was associated with intermittent fever, bilateral frontal headache, and mucoid nasal discharge. There was past history of FES for chronic allergic sinusitis associated with bilateral sinonasal polyposis, and there was no history of systemic illness or any ocular surgery or trauma. On ocular examination, the BCVA in left eye was 618, and there was grade 2 RAPD along with the ebaxial proptosis with hypoglobus, and resistance to retropulsion was present. Exophthalmometry showed 28 mm of proptosis. On ENT examination, anterior rhinoscopy showed bilateral inferior turbinate hypertrophy. Systemic investigation showed mild leukocytosis, and CT scan of the orbit showed a heterogeneous mass arising from the left frontoethmoidal sinus and infiltrating the left orbit, which is causing the indentation of the globe as shown by the yellow arrow, and also the tinting of the optic nerve. MRI of the brain and orbit showed peripherally enhancing areas in bilateral nasal cavity, right more than the left, and bilateral also in the bilateral ethmoidal, frontal, sphenoidal, and maxillary sinuses. The lesions are seen to extend in both the orbits. Along with in the left orbit, it is causing the significant mass effect on the compression as well as the compression on the extraocular muscle with the resultant proptosis, and in the right orbit, it is causing mass effect on the medial rectus muscle. Coming on to the differential diagnosis, my first differential was pan-sinus mucopyocele, and the second was fungal mass, and the third was the sinonasal malignancy. The patient underwent endoscopic guided white bone needle aspiration of pus along with the exploration and biopsy. Pus and straw-colored fluid had undergone microbiological examination, which was non-revealing of any microorganism. Biopsy tissue showed mucosa tissue lined with ciliated columnar epithelium along with the scattered seromucinous gland and along with the mixed inflammatory infiltrate composed of lymphocytes, foamy macrophages, and neutrophils. Now, my final diagnosis was acute proptosis secondary to bilateral pan-sinus mucopyocele with orbital compartment syndrome. At 2 weeks follow-up, patient proptosis was relieved. BCVA was 6.6 in both eyes, and extraocular movement was full and free in all gazes with the resolution of RAPD. Now, coming on to the discussion, bilateral pan-sinus mucopyocele is a rare entity, and traditionally mucocele has a slowly expansile nature and presents later in the course. However, in our case, we had acute proptosis with orbital compartment syndrome, and to the best of our knowledge, such kind of occurrences has not been reported previously. Mucocele usually accompanies the path to the least resistance, which often leads to the orbital extension. MRI is the gold standard investigation, whereas the investigation of choice is CE-CT, as it helps us to delineate the bony erosions. Endoscopic orbital decompression should be considered, and primary etiology should be targeted to relieve the intraorbital pressure. Now, coming on to the learning points, mucopyocele paranasal sinus in paranasal sinus should constitute an important differential in a case of rapidly progressive proptosis, especially in with the cases of the history of sinus surgery. Rapidly progressive proptosis with orbital compartment syndrome indicates the development of mucopyocele and needs urgent intervention for preventing irreversible vision loss. Endoscopic exploration and decompression provides
Dr. Khushbu, just sum up. Your time is up, please.
And therapeutic intervention in these cases. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khushbu. Dr. Shalu, would you like to comment on this paper?
Yeah, Dr. Khushbu, very nice documentation. Yeah, these cases, mucopyocele usually present to us when they have a vision problem. They have the acute presentation and they neglect the nasal symptoms or this thing. That's why they present late. And their prognosis is very good if the endoscopic debridement is done. Yeah, they do regain their vision, and the outcome is very good in these cases. So the early intervention is must in these cases, and MRI is gives us a good clue how to act. It was a good case and it showed a good resolution.
Yes.
Ma'am, you want to add something?
No, I agree with you. And it's important to pick up all of these cases early. You should, unless the mind is looking for it, you won't see it. So it's good. You must suspect and try to pick it up early so that we can get a good result like you have got. Okay. Thank you, doctor. We'll now go to the next paper. I'll call Dr. Sunanda Nandi.
Yes, ma'am. I'm just sharing the screen, ma'am.
Okay.
Shall I start, ma'am?
Yes, please, you can start.
Please start.
Yes. So good afternoon all. Today I'm going to present before you my paper, that is Unilateral Proptosis, the Untold Mystery of the Pandora Box, the Orbit, Etiology and Management. So to start with, proptosis refers to forward protrusion of the globe with respect to the orbit. The causes of unilateral proptosis are innumerable. The importance lies in early diagnosis, timely intervention, and prevention of complication, as it can cause potentially blinding and even life-threatening events. So my aims and objective of this study was to study ophthalmology cases presenting with unilateral proptosis and to analyze the clinical profile of such cases. Coming over to the materials and methods, the present clinical study of unilateral proptosis was conducted in my college, that was Assam Medical College, Dibrugarh, for a period of 1 year. Inclusion criteria consists of cases presenting with unilateral proptosis, and exclusion criteria was all cases presenting with pseudoproptosis and cases presenting with ocular trauma like penetrating injuries and perforating injuries. The proper selection of the cases for exophthalmometry was done and Lutz exophthalmometer was used. A detailed history related to the disease condition was taken. Visual acuity and a detailed local ophthalmological examination was done, and etiopathological diagnosis was done on the basis of local clinical examination, laboratory test, and relevant radiological examinations. According to the etiopathological diagnosis, a management strategy was individualized for each case. Now, coming over to the results, a total of 40 cases of unilateral proptosis was taken. Coming over to the age distribution, the patients were between 1 year to 73 years of age, and most of the cases were between 31 to 45 years. Male was outnumbered the female patients. In clinical presentation, there was clinical features varied from watering, redness, discharge to ocular pain, loss of vision, loss of weight, fever, diplopia, and even white reflex. It was seen that the right eye was more affected than the left eye, and the type of proptosis was axial in more nature than eccentric. The amount of proptosis varied from 2 mm to 15 mm. And the visual acuity varied in various patients, especially it was seen in between 6/9 to 6/18. In the ophthalmoscopic findings, we could, basically all was normal, but we could also find optic nerve head edema, facial toxicity, and choroidal folds also. ENT findings, we could see sinusitis more in cases. In the radiological findings in relation to the orbit, we could see that there was normal in most of the cases, but there was also presence of soft tissue mass in some cases and fractures. In the ultrasonographic examination, we saw that there was more of mass lesions followed by inflammatory lesions. In the CT scan finding, we could see that there were more of intraconal space occupying lesion followed by extraconal, followed by inflammatory, and followed by other findings. In the histopathological reports, we could see various features like rhabdomyosarcoma, pseudotumor, small cell carcinoma, retinoblastoma, malignant melanoma, cavernous hemangioma, and also small squamous cell carcinoma. So coming over to the etiological distribution, we could see that there was more of the neoplastic group, then inflammatory group, then endocrine, followed by vascular. So these are the photographs. According to the etiopathogenesis, the various treatment modalities that were chosen was conservative surgical, chemo, or radiotherapy. So these are the visual restoration chart. And coming over to the discussion, we all know that proptosis present the ophthalmology with a serious problem because of the diversity of the etiological factors it present with. Age of the patient is a cardinal factor in the initial assessment of a possible cause. In the present study, maximum number of patients with proptosis were found in the second decade, which was consistent with the study that was done by Dr. Shiva et al. Also, in some of the case papers, that is by Babita Sharma et al. And Susan D'Souza et al., in which we could see that there was more of the axial proptosis, that was also consistent in my study. Clinical findings was also consistent in the study of Masood et al. And Shawarma et al. paper. Also, the etiological distribution of the cases present in the present study correlated with the reported incidence of the study of Babita Sharma et al. in which the most common cause of proptosis was neoplasm, which was similar to my study. In contrast to this, Kavita P. Vasu et al. Showed that the most common cause of proptosis was inflammation. So to conclude, unilateral proptosis is a multidisciplinary problem and requires collaboration of other specialties. Considering the diverse etiology of the diseases causing proptosis, definitive management varies accordingly. CT scan was useful to demonstrate the precise extension of the orbital lesion and the involvement of paranasal sinuses and nasal cavity. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. Can you please stop the sharing?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sunanda. That was a comprehensive documentation. I would just like to emphasize that yes, in a proptosis case, we must be looking beyond the eye and the orbit, because the lesion can come from any of the surrounding the sinuses. So very important, the radiological is very important. And also the acute and chronicity is also important. Acute proptosis doesn't always mean an inflammatory. Even granulocytic sarcomas or rhabdomyosarcomas can present in an acute. So important to highlight, because the acute one presumes is inflammatory or an infection, but it could also be a malignancy or a neoplastic growth. Yeah. Okay, so we'll go on to the next speaker. That's Dr. Kavita R. Bhatnagar.
Yes, she's here. Dr. Kavita, can you hear us?
Not here? Okay. We'll go to the next one, Dr. Ashok Rathi. Are you here?
I guess Dr. Kavita is here. Let me.
She's here?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's. Dr. Kavita, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Unmute her.
Am I audible?
Yes, please share your screen.
Yes, share your screen.
I have shared my screen.
I think you need to stop it and share it once again, please.
Okay. Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible now.
It's visible. Is the size okay? Can you just zoom it? For the ease of presentation, I have put up all my slides on one poster so that I wasn't too sure of, being able to share the PPTs and move the slides. So I thought I'll better put it up.
Fine, Doctor. If you can increase it, do it on slide. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You just move up and down. Yes. Please start. Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'll be sharing my work on impact of type, power, and access of astigmatism, as well as typography on visual performance. We all know that astigmatism affects visual performance adversely. So this study aims at identifying the effect of type, which is defined by axis as with the rule and against the rule astigmatism, and magnitude of error, as well as typography. We compared Hindi versus Roman alphabets on visual acuity for both distance as well as near, and also reading fluency with Hindi versus English. That was our main aim. So these were our inclusion criteria. We selected patients in 18 to 35 age group whose first and second spoken languages were Hindi and Roman respectively, that is Hindi and English. And the BCVA should be 6/9 or better. Patients were divided into 6 groups, 3 groups with the rule astigmatism and 3 groups with against the rule astigmatism, in increasing order of astigmatism power. A total of 430 patients were included in the study, out of which 290 were males and 123 were females, with mean age of 23.92. Majority of the patients had refractive errors between 0.25 to 1 diopter, and the second group, highest group, was 1 to 2 diopters. The reduction in distance and near visual acuity worsened with modulus of astigmatism with a significant p-value. There was significant reduction in reading speed with modulus of astigmatis, and reading rates with against the rule astigmatis was significantly slower than with the rule astigmatis for all font sizes. And overall reduction in reading rate was significantly higher for Hindi typography compared to Roman typography. And we couldn't find any, study, Indian study, where we have compared Hindi with other languages. So these are the graphs showing the results. Our findings corroborate with some of the international studies who have also reported that cross cylinder against the rule astigmatis and oblique astigmatis had greater detrimental impact on both distance and near visual acuity, and also reading rates were slower for higher degree of astigmatis and more adversely affected with against the rule astigmatis. So it's the against the rule astigmatis which creates more problem even with lower level of astigmatis. And reading rates were worse for Hindi typography as it requires higher level of cognitive input. So to conclude, the visual acuity proportionately decreases with increase in power of astigmatis, with against the rule type of astigmatis, and reading rate significantly decreases with Hindi typography. So thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This is a great initiative. So I would like to ask you, ma'am, is it you have not taken any oblique astigmatics in this series?
We have not taken oblique. We have not taken oblique astigmatism.
So you are just comparing between the with the rule and against the rule astigmatism up to two diopters.
Up to 2 diopters.
Okay, ma'am, is the
Hindi versus English alphabets also.
Okay, ma'am. So
percentage of decrease in reading rate.
Yes, ma'am. So do you feel the angle that is subtended by these Hindi letters is different from those of the Roman letters, or have you made it?
Yes, it is different. Yes, it is different. It is more complex. It is more complex. So,
Okay.
at the level of, it is at the level of brain, maybe, the time taken to understand the Hindi alphabet is much more than English.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for the presentation. Any other question from the panelists?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Deori. We'll go on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Dr. Ashok Rathi, atypical presentation of capillary hemangioma. Dr. Ashok, are you here?
I guess Ashok Rathi is not here. So
okay.
Can we go for
the next? To the next one? It's Dr. Saura Kamal Datta. Are you here?
Yeah, he's here.
Okay, great.
Please share your screen, Dr. Saura. Yeah, we can see your screen. It's a thank you image.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Saura Kamal. I'm going to present a case on ophthalmia neodymium, which was found out to be due to gonococcus. A 3-day-old child came to us from Dhonipur, Kachar, Assam. It is a rural part of Assam. In emergency hours on February 2019, the mother complained of discharge from both eyes from one day. The discharge was from both the eyes, and it was gradually increasing in severity. It was associated with swelling of the lids, so which led to closing of the eyes. And there was no history of any trauma during or after delivery. There was no history of any installation of any substance after birth or insect bites. The child was delivered at a local PHC at term pregnancy by normal vaginal delivery. There was no history of premature rupture of membranes or use of any forceps during delivery. The child cried after birth and breastfeeding was started within half an hour of delivery. On taking the history of parents, we found that the mother had a complaint of discharge from vagina since 8th week of gestation. Otherwise, she was apparently normal and she had not taken medication for this discharge. Also, the father of the child had discharged from urethra last 6 months. while both the parents refused having any multiple sexual partners. The family belonged to a very low socioeconomic status and lived in a kacha house with very poor sanitation. They lived in as a joint family and with their parents, and all were apparently having good health. On examining the child, we found that the child was febrile and active. He was feeding well. On systemic examination, it was all normal. On examination of the eyes, the lids were edematous and the conjunctiva was congested with very perforating discharge. We can see in these pictures, the the lids were edematous and the lashes are matted with profuse discharge. And it cannot be opened easily. So using Descemet's retractor, we had to open the eyes to examine the case, and we took some swabs for cultural sensitivity, gram staining, and KOH mount. I found that it was a gram-negative diplococci. So subsequently, we took swabs from the parents also, vaginal swabs and urethral swabs from father and mother, also found the gram-negative diplococci. So we went for the virology of the child, and it was found negative. The sepsis screen, which was advised by pediatrics, also we did. It was also found to be negative. This is the microbiology. This is the under microscope picture of the conjunctival swab. We can see multiple polymorphonucleoside cells along with diplococci, intracellular diplococci. The microbiological report showed multiple gram-negative diplococci suggestive of coronavirus. So we sent the parents to the STD clinic, and from the STD clinic, they were advised kit 1 and kit 2 as per NACO protocol. And the conjunctival and the swabs were taken from the parents also, and virology was done. Both were negative. So a diagnosis of gonococcal ophthalmia neutrum was attained. We started the treatment of systemic antibiotic along with local antibiotic. Local antibiotic we gave azithromycin. On day 2, the discharge of the patient of both the eyes reduced along with the reduction in edema. By day 5, we can see that there is spontaneous eye opening along with no edema. The child was happy and he was alert. He was taking food normally. So the take-home message of my presentation is that though the incidence of gonococcal conjunctivitis is reduced substantially in recent years, but it is still prevalent in very rural and remote parts of the country. So high index of suspicion in such cases is necessary. And whenever we suspect if a case of gonococcal conjunctivitis, then we have to take history from the parents, and so that we can take proper care and prevent complications in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sora. Dr. Shalu, would you like to lead the discussion on this one?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sora. This is, gonococcal conjunctivitis, as you have emphasized, is very rarely seen these days. And in infant, we should keep this as a high index of suspicion. And hygiene is very important. Parental history, you have already emphasized that we should take the parental history. So, and well-managed case, this was a good case.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it was an interesting case because these are sort of things only in our textbooks. It's once in a while, it is good to see these unusual cases and manage them well. Okay, thank you, doctors. We will now go to the next paper, which is Dr. Shreya Poddar. Is she here? Dr. Shreya Poddar?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Please start.
A very good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to present a case report on destructive ocular myiasis. A brief history. A 70-year-old man from Borpeta, Assam presented to our OPD with a chief complaints of swelling of left eye with periorbital area, left side more than right side since 15 days, few ulcerative lesions over left eyebrow since 2 days, few larvae wriggling out since 1 day, and associated symptoms were severe pain, bloody discharge from ulcerated area, and diminution of vision of left eye. The patient is a diagnosed case of pemphigus vulgaris since 2 years, and he also suffers from atrophic rhinitis since 6 months. He is a chronic ethanol. On examination, vision of right eye was 624. Extraocular movements were full free and painless. Eyelids were mildly swollen, mostly towards the medial canthus. Conjunctiva was mildly congested. Cornea was clear, and other intersegment details of right eye were within normal limits. Left eye vision was PL negative. Extraocular movement was restricted. Eyelids were swollen and ulcerated with periorbital area involved. There was decreased interpalpebral aperture. Conjunctiva was chemosed, and cornea was very hazy and edematous, due to which the other intersegment details could not be assessed. general examination. Blood pressure and pulse rate are within normal limits. Other systemic examination were within normal limits. Cutaneous examination revealed pemphigus vulgaris. Blood investigations were done in which total count was increased with increased neutrophils. Blood sugar was within normal limits. ESR was raised, and other viral markers were non-reactive. CT scan brain revealed cerebral atrophic changes, soft tissue density lesion involving left nasal cavity, ethmoid air sinus, and left orbit, with destruction of left nasal bone and ethmoid air cells. MRI, which was done 2 days later, showed the shape of the left eyeball was changed and normal structure could not be identified, but there were no intracranial extension. This is the disease progression. This is the initial presentation of the patient in day 1. These are the day 2 and day 3 images where there is complete destruction of the orbital adnexa with maggots wriggling out. These pictures were taken after the removal of the maggots and antiseptic dressing, which was done for that day. So treatment, topical antibiotics and steroid combinations were started, as well as systemic treatment was given as 6 mg single dose oral ivermectin, levofloxacin 500 mg for 10 days, and analgesics. The patient was also undergoing simultaneous treatment for atrophic rhinitis, pemphigus vulgaris, psychosis by ENT dermatology and psychiatry department respectively. So maggots were manually removed with careful application of turpentine oil so that the right eye is not harmed. This was regularly done for a week with antiseptic dressings until no maggots were remaining. The larva was stored in a saline solution for further investigation by microbiology department. It came out to be the larva of Ostrus ovis, that is sheepbot fly. Secondary healing occurred gradually over a month and the wound healed well, but the left eye was completely destroyed. Unfortunately, the patient lost to follow-up. In a nutshell, our patient here was in an immunocompromised state because of steroid treatment, chronic alcoholism, and also low socioeconomic status, living in poor rural area with poor health control and poor hygiene. Atrophic rhinitis being one of the commonest predisposing factors to myiasis, this patient was highly suspected to have initial nasal myiasis as a result of it that proceeded towards orbit. Myiasis occurs in people who suffer from atrophic rhinitis due to diphterous flies as a result of reduced sneezing reflex and widened nasal cavity. Due to aggressive form of the disease, which lead to complete destruction of the orbital tissue as happened in this case, it is important to start treatment as soon as possible. Conclusion. Orbital myiasis is a very rare condition and a very few number of cases are still observed. The risk factor for myiasis are open wounds and ulcers contaminated with discharges and blood remnants and increased with debilitation, mental and physical disability. Treatment would consist of prevention would consist of practicing adequate personal hygiene, proper care of wounds, and treatment of debilitating underlying conditions. A complete epidemiological survey of myiasis in a country with multiple risk factors such as ours will help in better treatment, management, and prevention of such cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shreya. So in this case, what do you think? I mean, it came to you in an advanced condition, or was it a very fast progression, or did he ignore it?
Yeah, actually, he ignored it, ma'am. What happened is the patient had this swelling in the eyelid portion, but the patient was debilitated and he had some other health issue, just totally ignored. So he came late. But within 1 day, this ulceration happened, and within overnight, the complete destruction of the tissues happened.
So you're saying the predisposing factor is the immunocompromised state and that it enters through the nasal mucosa? Did you also do biopsy of the nasal mucosa just to know whether that was the starting point?
Ma'am, actually, the patient was being treated by ENT department, so they diagnosed the case to be like atrophic rhinitis. So,
okay, they didn't look for any infective component over there.
Just the microbiology examination of the larva.
So, what is the message here that you would like to give from your case?
Ma'am, usually what happened is when this kind of cases, since this has a very fast progression, it should be treated as soon as possible. Also, ma'am, prevention of these cases can be done by like improving the health conditions and proper hygiene and proper hygiene.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Shreya. That was an interesting case. We'll now call Dr. Manogna. Dr. Manogna, are you there?
I'm not able to find Dr. Manogna here.
Okay. So we'll go to the next speaker, and then by that time she'll come. Dr. Samiksha, are you here, Dr. Samiksha?
Yes, ma'am. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, Samiksha.
Okay.
Good afternoon to everyone present here. I sincerely thank the AIOS body for giving me this opportunity to present our work on the clinical profile of thyroid orbitopathy, specifically based on systemic thyroid status. I'm a senior resident at PGI Chandigarh. So as we all know, thyroid orbitopathy is an inflammatory disorder of autoimmune origin. There are several classification systems that have come up. The most recent and the most clinically relevant one is the VISA classification system. And there are several previous studies that have said that milder forms of TAO are normally seen in hypo and euthyroid patients. So we aim to see our patients and how they did according to the VISA classification and according to their thyroid status. So we enrolled prospectively in a cross-sectional manner. We enrolled about 129 patients over 17 months. More than 90% of them had a known thyroid disorder, while about 6% of them presented with ocular symptoms and were subsequently diagnosed to have thyroid disease. 70% of them were hyperthyroid at presentation, about 20% of them were hypothyroid, and about 5% were euthyroid. The mean age at presentation was 40.7 years, which was a little less than what was the global average reported. Of note was the fact that hyperthyroid group presented earlier than the hypo and the euthyroid group. We did see a slightly higher proportion of males. The female to male ratio was about 1.15, while the global average is about a 9 or 2:1. We also noted that as the age at presentation increases, there was a higher proportion of males in that particular age group. When it came to the clinical profile, forward protrusion of the eye proptosis and lid edema were the most common presenting symptoms. Specifically, hypothyroid patients had more likelihood of presenting with lid retraction. Euthyroid patients almost always presented with proptosis, and hypothyroid group specifically presented with lid edema more often than the other groups. So as I had previously mentioned, about 6% of our patients presented with thyroid eye disease first. About 52 patients in our cohort had concomitant thyroid eye disease and systemic thyroid dysfunction, and about 68 of them had thyroid eye disease, systemic thyroid disease first. Amongst the systemic risk factors, we had 13% patients who had a positive family history. Smoking was present in about 15% of our patients. Most of them belonged to the hyperthyroid group. So we looked at our patients when it came to the VISA classification too. And we found that decreased vision was present in about 18% of our patients. And most of them were in the hypothyroid group. The color vision was less only in about 3.9% patients, but it did not differ significantly between the groups. Visual field function was normal in the 86% of our patients. When it came to the inflammatory index, we found that 10 patients had active disease, and of which 9 of them were belonging to the hyperthyroid group, while only 1 was euthyroid and none in the hypothyroid group. When it came to the strabismus, we had 11% patients presenting with diplopia, of which 6.2% had strabismus. So the hyperthyroid group with active disease were much more, almost exclusively, this group had a restriction of ocular movements. When it came to appearance, hypothyroid group had a higher proportion having a mild appearance, and the severe appearance was almost equally distributed in hypothyroid group, but the proportions may be a little bit off because of the proportion of patients in each of these groups. These were the treatment details that they were taking according to the systemic thyroid status. So to kind of summarize what we were seeing, basically we found that the proportion of hypothyroid patients was a little bit higher in our cohort. We also found lesser female to male ratio and lesser mean age at presentation, and proptosis was the most common symptom. Higher disease activity was seen in the hyperthyroid group along with lid retraction and lag of thalamus, and there was no significant difference in the risk factors and how it contributed to disease activity. I would like to bring your attention to this very good paper that came out of LV Prasad Institute, in which they also saw that the average age of presentation was about 45 years, and they did see a higher proportion of males, and 1/3 of them, 1/3 of their patients were euthyroid. This differed a little bit from our presentation. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present our data. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Samiksha. That was a really well-documented study. Very nice. You have highlighted a lot of good points. Dr. Shalu, Would you like to take the discussion on this?
Yeah, Dr. Samiksha, all your patients were already thyroid patients, or they came to you and then you had asked them to go for the thyroid, depending upon the clinical presentation?
Yes, ma'am, about 6% of our patients came to us directly, and then we, depending on the clinical symptoms, we suspected thyroid eye disease and we asked them to get the test done.
Okay.
Over 90% were already diagnosed to have thyroid disorder.
And most of them were hyperthyroid.
Yes, ma'am.
But usually nowadays we see euthyroid patients also but in your group, euthyroid group was very less.
Yes, yes, ma'am. This paper from LV Prasad, they had a higher proportion of euthyroid patients. It could be a referral bias, ma'am. That's what I think of.
Yeah.
A very good paper, Dr. Samiksha. And how some of the patients did have a medical or surgical management from your side? Any of them required?
This is a cross-sectional study, so we only took their data when they first came in. Some of them did require surgical correction, but there were only 2 patients in this cohort who had severe disease that required such correction.
And they were well managed with thyroid, basically endocrinologist.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Any input from Dr. Anita, ma'am?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just interesting to highlight that traditionally we feel that it's women more, it's, you know, the age group also, they seem to have picked up a lower age group. So it means that one should be alert that even in euthyroid, even in a younger age, a male, if there is a proptosis, we must keep thyroid in mind. Yeah. And some of these cases, as you showed in one of the pictures, can have a very bad outcome. Yes. So we should be able to pick it up early and avoid it reaching a stage where there is loss of vision. So important to be aware of all the findings, and you really documented it very well. And this is something we should all keep in our general practice. Thank you, Dr. Samiksha. We'll now go to the next speaker. Yeah. This is Dr. Meha Kaur Gill. Is she here?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. I'm just about to share the screen.
Okay, okay, Dr. Gill, come.
Just to update, after Dr. Meheklin, we have Dr. Bhupesh Singh, then we have Dr. Farhad Mansoori, and then we have Dr. Abhishek Onkar.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible. You can proceed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting a rare case report on Goldenhar syndrome. It is a rare case. I'm reporting a rare case of 8-month-old boy presenting in our OPD with limbal dermoid encroaching over the cornea in the right eye associated with ear tag on the ipsilateral side and with scoliosis suspected to have Goldenhar syndrome. It is a birth defect resulting from malformation of first 2 brachial arches, which lead to incomplete development of ear, nose, soft palate, lip, and mandible. It is also known as oculo-auriculovertebral dysplasia, which has limbal dermoid, preauricular tags, hemifacial asymmetry, and vertebral anomalies. It is usually unilateral, and it occurs in 1 to 3,500 to 1 in 7,000 live births, and the male to female ratio is 3:2. Now in my case report, it's an 8-month-old patient who was brought into the ophthalmology department by parents with a complaint of mass in the right eye with associated preauricular tag present in the right ear since birth. The child was a full-term normal delivery, and there was no history of any maternal illness during the pregnancy. He was a first-born child from a non-consanguineous marriage with uneventful prenatal antenatal period with no drug allergy or known medical history. All the other family members were normal. On my ophthalmological examination, a mass was present on the limbus from 7 to 9 o'clock position, encroaching the cornea and gradually increasing in size. The mass was whitish pinkish in color with well-defined margins, firm in consistency, and it was circular with 2 into 2 mm size, and it was non-compressible. The mass was adherent to the underlying cornea and sclera. Rest of the anterior segment examination came out to be normal. The fundus examination was normal. Now, there was a multidisciplinary approach taken by all the departments. When the patient was sent to the ENT for ENT examination, there was an ipsilateral ear tag present on the same side with no other abnormality in the ear. The patient was then referred to the pediatrics department, and no other systemic abnormality was diagnosed. Then next, the radiological investigation when done, X-ray revealed vertebral column scoliosis. Now there are different differential diagnoses were seen. First being the Goldenhar, second being the Treacher-Collins syndrome, third being the Townes-Brocks syndrome, fourth being the linear-nevus sebaceous of Jedesson, and fourth being the Chard syndrome. But based on the clinical and radiological findings, diagnosis of Goldenhar syndrome was made. Now the treatment was given. It was the limbal dermoid. It was excised, and then the amniotic graft was sutured upon the bare conjunctiva, so as to prevent the development of amblyopia, that and also the induced astigmatism caused by the corneal structure abnormality, to reduce it. So we excised the limbal dermoid. On histopathological report when sent, it showed squamous epithelium and sebaceous glands in the specimen, giving impression of limbal dermoid. Preauricular tag was removed by the ENT department. Scoliosis was managed by the orthopedicians by giving a Milwaukee brace, and the child was kept on the regular follow-up after surgery to look for post-op complication. This is the ear tag, this is the limbal dermoid, and this is the X-ray showing the scoliosis. Now in my discussion, I would like to say that the ocular manifestations in Goldenhar can be limbal dermoid or lipodermoid, limbal dermoid being more common, and it is usually present in 25% of the cases in the inferior temporal quadrant. There are two types, large and small. The large one interferes with the visual axis, causing astigmatism and predisposing to secondary strabismus from anisotropy, amblyopia. Now, the other findings that can be included are hemifacial asymmetry, microtia, macrosomia, and mandibular anomalies. Now, the treatment of the disease varies according to the severity of the manifestation. With regard to the rule of ophthalmology, is aimed first at the risk causing obstruction of visual axis, severe astigmatism or strabismus. Second, we see for the ocular exposure due to the large coloboma or large limbal dermoid preventing the lid closure. Now, treatment of the condition related to large coloboma requires surgical repair. It should be removed, excised with limbular keratoplasty. Now, to conclude my case, I would like to say that it's a rare congenital abnormality associated with cosmetically unacceptable defects, whose management may pose numerous challenges. This case has been presented to increase the awareness of this rare entity, and it was a challenging one, as Goldenhar needs multidisciplinary approach and a high degree of suspicion. We should always rule out other congenital abnormalities. This is the bibliography. Thank you.
Thank you. May I please have your name? Dr.
Mehki.
Mehki. Okay, that was a nice presentation. Congratulations on the presentation. But just one point I would like to make is that your screen, the PPT, should be a little more visible, like the background. It was a little difficult.
Well, actually, I had a different background. I don't know why when I presented it.
Okay, no problem, no problem, no problem. Now, you said that it is a rare presentation. Why do you feel that it is a rare presentation?
Ma'am, otherwise, when we see in the history, it's 1 in 3,500 to 7,000 births. And in my 2 years of experience as a GR, I have just seen 2 cases. One which I've reported and other one I cannot follow up.
Okay, okay. Although it is very rare, but we do find these birth defects, and it was well managed. That is good. But sometimes we also may have, for your information, I'm saying that we can have microsomia of one side, and that also might require your palatal, reconstruction in certain patients. And sometimes you may have more than one dermoid also in the eye. So that also requires aggressive as well as very early treatment from the cornea department. Okay, so that was really nice. Take care of the dry eye part in these patients on follow-up.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mehki. I would just like to add that these cases demonstrate how we as orbital surgeons really need to be in close contact with, say, the cornea surgeon, ENT surgeon. We really need to have a very good, network to help us.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so now we'll go on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Dr. Bhupesh Singh. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Dr. Bhupesh, please.
Is my slide visible?
Yes.
Is my slide visible?
Yes, please start.
Okay. Good afternoon, respected faculty, and I'm going to present my paper on visual outcomes after refractive laser cornea surgery and phakic IOLs in adult amblyopic eyes. I have no financial disclosures to make in this presentation. To compare, the purpose of this study was to compare visual outcomes in adult amblyopic eyes after laser surgery, phakic intraocular lens implantation. This was a retrospective study and largest study so far of 680 eyes. And the study period was between February 2013 to July 2019, and the follow-up was 1 year. The patient with refractive amblyopia with a corrected distance visual acuity of 0.6 or worse and no improvement with the pinhole evaluation in an otherwise normal eye who underwent laser refractive surgery or phakic IOL were included in the study. The fellow eye had CTVA of 0.7 or better, and at least 2 difference was noted. The 2 study groups comprises 524 eyes in laser refractive surgery, 1 eyes in phakic eyes were included. The mean patient age was 24 years, and these were the refractive correction range which were included in the study. Coming to the results, out of 680 eyes at 1 year follow-up, 65.4% of eyes showed 1 line of improvement, whereas 26.1% of eyes showed 2 lines of improvement. And showed 3.6% of patients who have shown no improvement in the study. Regarding the corrected distance visual acuity over the follow-up period, from day 3 to up to 1 year, the visual acuity was well maintained at the same level. We also compared the corrected distance visual acuity between the 2 groups, LASIK and ICL group, and we found that the visual acuity improved in both the groups, and the improvement was better in the ICL group, although the difference was not statistically significant. We also checked the qualitative analysis of visual vision, and we did the MTF function at 3 mm pupil, and we found that almost all the patients showed good improvement in MTF at all spatial frequencies. There are some literature which have shown that there is improvement in visual acuity in amblyopic patients who are underwent LASIK. In the study by George, eyes and shown that 91.5% of the patients showed 1 line gain. If we talk about the cause, what makes these patients improvement in visual acuity because they don't improve with the glasses, it could be relative magnification of retinal image both in corneal and posterior chamber plane correction. It could be due to relative reduction in amblyopia. Whereas ICL perform better than LASIK, it may be because the gain is greater when the correction is located closer to the nodal point of the eye. So this could be the reason for this results. And the improvement in contrast sensitivity might be attributed to refractive correction and or the elimination of anisometropia or an anisoconia. So these are the reasons for the results. So in conclusion, adults wishing to have refractive surgery can do so despite having amblyopia, although the proven mechanism of improvement in visual acuity in these adults is still limited.
Thank you, Dr. Bhupesh. We seem to have wandered out of the orbit into the anterior segment, but still an interesting paper. Was your, Dr. Bhupesh is still here, no? Right. Was the type or the amount of refractive error an indication of who would improve more? Were they all myopes that you took, or were there some hypermetropes as well?
So around, we have taken 48 eyes who were hypermetropic.
Okay.
And the results improvement was better in the hypermetropic amblyopic eyes, but not statistically significant, but difference was there in improvement.
And between LASIK and ICL in the hypermetropic eyes?
Definitely ICL performs better than the LASIK in terms of vision, also in terms of contrast sensitivity also.
Okay. And was there astigmatism as well? Did that have any effect?
It was, so most of the patients have 0 to 2.5 diopters, but we couldn't find any significant.
No correlation.
Yeah, no correlation.
And did you have any cutoff for the amount of amblyopia, any vision level that we will not take if it's just 6/60 or something? Was there a cutoff like that?
So patients who have less than 624 vision, we don't take those patients for the surgery because it's not useful for them. If we are already 660, 24, it is not going to help them. But they won't have the binocularity.
Okay. And was there an age group cutoff? What age of the patients you took?
Most of the patients are young. around 20 to 24 years, so no significant difference.
Okay. And when you take up these cases, do you tell the patient, because in an amblyopic case, we don't know how much increase in vision would be.
So,
how do you
yeah,
counsel the patient?
So primary aim is we tell patient we are doing this, and this is in addition.
Thank you so much,
We don't promise
doctors.
anything that you're going to gain vision, but
All right,
but after
moving on to the
We
next.
have 10 minutes
now we
for panel
confidently
discussion.
say that
Right.
vision
Okay,
will
Dr.
be
Bhupesh
same
will take
or
this up.
some improvement.
We'll take this up
So
later.
I would
We'll
request
move
the
on to next
moderators
speaker.
and all the speakers of this session to go ahead with a panel discussion till
No problem.
2:55.
Right, okay. So we'll call in the next speaker, that's Dr. Farhad Mansoori.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please, doctor, please continue.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is my screen visible?
Yes. Start.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Farhad Mansoori and presenting a case report of choroidal osteoma with choroidal neovascular membrane, and there is nil financial disclosure with this presentation. As we all know that choroidal osteoma is a rare benign tumor of an unilateral condition ossifying in nature characterized by mature cancellous bone involving the choroid. Tumor affects the juxtapapillary and macular areas of retina and seen as an orange irregular subretinal mass with multiple small tufts on the surface. And the bone was treated by radiography, ecography, or computed tomography. Choroidal osteoma commonly leads to choroidal neovascularization and also associated with subretinal fluid, hemorrhages, and serous retinal detachment. Therapies are directed for such complications. We reported a 37-year-old male patient presented to our institute with complaint of diminution of vision in the left eye since 8 to 9 months, which was gradual, painless, and progressive in nature and exaggerated from last 10 to 15 days. The best corrected visual acuity was 6/6 in the right eye and 6/18 in the left eye, and the entire segments of both eyes were normal, and intraocular pressures were normal in dilated fundus examination. The choroidal osteoma with choroidal neovascularization with subretinal serous fluid with intraretinal edema was seen in the left eye and documented on fundus photograph. On B-scan ultrasound of left eye, the calcification of choroid was seen, and calcified mass in the posterolateral aspect of left eyeball was seen in the CT scan. On left eye OCT, we see a type 1 choroidal neovascularization, presence of subretinal fluid, and thus the diagnosis of choroidal osteoma with choroidal neovascularization with subretinal fluid was made, and the patient was advised treatment in the form of antivascular endothelial growth factor ranibizumab injection at monthly interval for 3 months. With each subsequent injection, we reported OCT, and we can see that after third dose of injection anti-VEGF, the patient visual acuity remained the same and didn't worsen. And the resolution of choroidal neovascularization and regression of subretinal fluid was noted. Thus, from the studies, we found that intravitreal injection of anti-VEGF like ranibizumab or bevacizumab are effective in choroidal osteoma as it reduces the permeability of choroidal vessels, which leads to regression of choroidal neovascularization, resolution of associated subretinal fluid, and improvement in visual acuity. From the documented study, Ji-Hoon Song showed that intravitreal injection of bevacizumab or ranibizumab for serous retinal detachment secondary to choroidal osteoma resulted in both visual and anatomical improvements. The other treatment modalities like laser photocoagulation and photodynamic therapy was tried in extrafoveal and subfoveal choroidal neovascularization by causing focal decalcification of the tumor, which conversely associated with overlying retinal damage, and photodynamic therapy might be visually detrimental, especially in subfoveal tumors, and require multiple sessions. The visual prognosis depends on the tumor location, decalcification status, overlying retinal pigment epithelial atrophy, presence of choroidal neovascularization, persistence of subretinal fluid, and occurrence of subretinal hemorrhage. Thus, finally, we can conclude that the aggressive management by repeated intravitreal injections of anti-VEGF are helpful in regression of choroidal neovascularization, and resorption of subretinal fluid of such a rare tumor can improve visual acuity and relieve the symptoms. These are my references. Thank you.
Dr. Deori, will you take this? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Farhat, for the wonderful presentation. So you feel that anti-VEGFs would be the first in case of choroidal osteoma. So that is what you wanted to present here?
Yes, ma'am. In case if it presents with choroidal neovascularization, then anti-VEGF are helpful.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Ma'am, Anita ma'am, would you like to add something to it?
Yeah, and what are your long-term follow-up on this? Does it recur? How many injections are required? Is there some protocol that you have to follow? How many number of injections, or is it just watching how it regresses?
Okay, from the literature, we have seen that at the follow-up of 10 years, even also it doesn't recur, and the decalcification of the tumor will not affect the visual acuity on long-term follow-up. But in our case, we have given just the injection, so we have only 1 month of follow-up, so that's the limitation of our case report.
Yeah, because many of these do tend to recur, so we need a long-term follow-up before we can actually comment on how useful it is. Okay, thank you, Dr. Farhat. We'll now go to the last speaker of the session, Dr. Abhishek Omkar. Are you here? Dr. Abhishek?
Very good.
Thank you so much. I can't find him, ma'am.
He's not there?
He's not here. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we've had some really interesting papers, and we do have 5 minutes for discussion. Would any of the panelists like to comment on any of the papers that they found some points that got missed?
Ma'am, I would like to have one question for Bhupesh sir, actually, regarding the ICL and the phakic iron.
This is an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting. My question is that if you are for the hyperopic group, if these patients are aniso-hyperopic patients, and you have taken up the patient when they became adults, so what was the amblyopic status when they were in the pediatric age group? What was the maximum correction? And the following next part to the question is that if they were operated for at around say 24 years, was there any neuroplasticity that was observed in these patients for which neurovision therapy was given?
Dr. Bhupesh, are you here?
Sir? I think Bhupesh sir has left.
I also had some more questions to ask him. Okay, I think all our papers were good. I particularly liked the thyroid associated neuropathy. That was a very good demonstration, and these are cases which really need to be comprehensively worked up so that you don't miss anything. And then, I mean, all the papers were interesting, even though they're only case presentations. Sometimes there is a lot to learn. You should not, you should have a good index of suspicion to pick up these cases early so that we don't miss anything. Dr. Shalu, would you like to say anything? Dr. Shalu, not there? Okay. I think we can then end the session. Yeah, Dr. Ruby has come. She's one of the presenters, right? Okay. So if there aren't any comments, then I thank you all for your time and your presentations and efforts. I thank my co-chairman, convener. Thank you, moderator. Thank you all for your time, and we can close this session.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And congratulations to all the participants.
Thank you all doctors to come complete.
Thank you so much.
On time. Thank you so much.